Welcome to the Brain Science Podcast, the show for everyone who has a brain. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and this is episode 120. I'd like to dedicate today's episode to my nephew, Scott Ritter, who died tragically on June 21st, 2015. Today's episode is the second part of my latest interview with Dr. Edward Taub about constraint-induced movement therapy. This is a revolutionary approach to stroke rehab that really taps into recent discoveries about brain plasticity. If you haven't listened to the first half of the interview, you might want to go back and grab episode 119. I'm going to jump right into this episode, and as usual, I'll be back at the end to summarize the key ideas and also to tell you about next month's episode. You can find the complete show notes and episode transcripts for this episode at brainsciencepodcast.com and send me feedback at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. I want to talk about some of the unusual areas that you're working in now, but there's one thing I want to make sure that I don't forget to cover before we do that. And we talked about this before, but it's really important, so I want to make sure we don't leave it out. About the importance of learned non-use and where that fits in to the equation.
Right. That's the other mechanism that we know is involved in the recovery of movement after different types of central nervous system damage. The first we've already talked about. It's neuroplasticity. By increasing the use of an arm just a little beyond the limits of the person's capacity to do it at a given point in time, you can increase the amount of gray matter, and in the last year we've demonstrated that we also get an increase in white matter tracts in the corticospinal tract, the corpus callosum. We get an increase in the integrity of these tracts. That's one half of the mechanistic explanation of why CI therapy works. And we came to that, the actual experimental demonstration that this occurs rather late in the game. We didn't start finding that out till the late 1990s. In terms of functional measures, we were able to show with fMRI that blood flow in the arm more affected by a stroke increased, meaning more nervous system activity in the arm area. We were able to do this with transcranial magnetic stimulation and showed that the area representing the affected arm doubled in size, literally, after CI therapy, back to normal size. It had shrunk by a half after stroke because the person wasn't using it. Then in the middle 2000s, we demonstrated that there was, consistent with these functional changes, a structural change, an actual remodeling. We might call what we did at first was to demonstrate that there was a rewiring of the brain by CI therapy. And in the middle of our first publication was in 2008, that there was a remodeling, not only a rewiring, but a remodeling of the brain, an increase in gray matter in different areas of the brain that we've already spoken about. So that's one half of the story. The other half is much older, and it goes back to my work with deafferented monkeys. Sherrington had, based on an experiment that he did in 1895, concluded from a deafferentation experiment that he did where the monkeys didn't use the arm. He left the motor innervation intact and he just abolished sensation. And he asked himself, why should eliminating sensation but leaving motor innervation intact prevent the animal from using the limb? And the answer that he came up with was eminently reasonable. It was that spinal reflexes was the basis of voluntary movement, the purpose of movement. And spinal reflexes were the basic building blocks upon which purpose of movement was elaborated. But we showed that that was not true. that a monkey with a single diaphragmated arm could be trained, not only trained, but forced to use the diaphragmated arm. So the Sherringtonian hypothesis, the reflex basis of movement and learning, it turned out, was not true. What would take its place? And the idea that I came up with, and at first it was just a speculation, was learned non-use. That is, at the beginning, after you've diaphragmated an arm or a person has had a stroke, you have a shock phenomenon that was originally called, at the beginning of the 20th century, spinal shock or cortical shock. The background of excitation upon which movement is based, elaborated, is not there. And so the affected arm just doesn't work. The individual really can't use the arm. As a result, in order to prevent the person from becoming helpless, he uses the less affected arm or the intact arm to do the work of both. Later on, there's a spontaneous recovery of function, a recovery of the excitation of the nervous system, and this is spontaneous, so that the person or the monkey could again use the arm if it tried, but it has already learned that that arm is useless, and it's learned to use the intact arm or the less affected arm to do the work of both. And this is a learning phenomenon. So the individual never tries to use the arm, or if he does try and it's successful, the habit of non-use of that arm is so overlearned and strong at that point that he or she never uses that arm, because the newly accomplished use of that arm has to compete with a very strongly overlearned non-use of that arm. And we call that learned non-use. It's a learning mechanism. And what CI therapy does is that it pulls off that learned non-use, and it does it very rapidly. The general statement of that hypothesis is that this will occur after any substantial injury to the nervous system. There'll be a loss of excitation. The organism, a monkey, a human being, or a rat. There are rat models of CI therapy and monkey models, quite a number of experiments along those lines, at least 100. You get exactly the same phenomenon. The hypothesis was that a substantial portion or some portion of any motor deficit after cortical damage is due to learned non-use.
And so when you look at the brain and you see the area devoted to, say, the affected arm is shrunk by 50%, some of that shrinkage is from non-use.
Yes, it's all due to non-use. Because if you use CI therapy, you can double that shrunken area, double its size back to normal size. It's not normal. There's still a deficit in the arm. We haven't succeeded in bringing most of our patients back to normal use. We can talk about whether that's possible or not in a little while, but focusing now on learned non-use, with monkeys, we did some experiments. One of them in particular was quite compelling because it was counterintuitive. The idea was, if monkeys really could use that arm but didn't, why didn't they? And if it was learned non-use, and if this was a learning phenomenon, if you prevented the monkey from using the diaphragmated arm for a period of time during which spontaneous recovery of excitation would occur, then if you remove the restraint from the animal, say 3 months after surgery, putting the animal in restraint of the diaphragmated arm on the operating room table, then they ought to never be able to learn that the arm was useless.
Sort of like when you go into a cast.
Yes, a cast would do. The problem with a cast is if you put a cast on a monkey's arm, he will spend all day doing nothing other than trying to get that cast off, and it will usually be successful no matter what you do.
Yeah, what I was thinking was like, when you break your arm and your arm is in a cast, your brain doesn't, I don't think it decides that arm doesn't work anymore. That's kind of what I meant.
that does happen. Actually, since we came up with the learn non-use hypothesis and our 2000 demonstration, it was found that if you cast a leg, for example, and do electrophysiological recording from stimulation of the leg before you put the cast on, this is in normal individuals, and leave the cast on for 2 weeks, and then remove the cast, the cortical representation of the leg will have shrunk considerably by, say, 50%. And if CI therapy will return the motor cortex or the arm representation in the motor cortex to normal size, it suggests that the whole shrinkage is due to non-use. And if that non-use is learned, then it's learned non-use. And so the hypothesis of learned non-use substituted for the Sherringtonian explanation of spinal reflexes being the basis of voluntary movement.
Does that mean that we could accidentally try to start stroke rehab too soon?
No. What you could do is by using CI therapy, try to prevent learned non-use from occurring in the first place. This has been done. It's been done in the United States, and the results are mixed. The results in chronic patients, and by the way, I should mention that before we had done our work, it was taken as traditional wisdom that in chronic patients, people who were 1 year or more past the initial damage to the brain could not have their movement improved no matter what technique you used. And all of my monkeys were chronic. And so when I decided at UAB to transfer, or try to transfer the results with monkeys to human beings after stroke, we started to work with chronic patients because my monkeys had been chronic. This is an advantage of not knowing anything about the field that you're going into to start research. I was completely ignorant, literally, of rehabilitation. I did not know what conventional techniques of rehabilitation consisted of. I had never seen it. The objective was just to do in human beings what we had done in the monkeys. And so I didn't know that the traditional wisdom was that working with chronic patients was useless. There was nothing that you could do to improve the movement. I learned that this is what physiatrists and occupational and physical therapists learned in their instruction. But it had no meaning to me as a psychologist because that certainly hadn't been the case with monkeys.
So your first therapist that you worked with when you first started doing this at UAB, were they resistant at first? Or
No. Interestingly, physiatrists were resistant, but never, at least here at UAB, the physical and occupational therapists they worked with, because they were aware that what they were doing in the clinic didn't transfer into the life situation. The first physical therapist that I worked with is named Jean Crago, and she told me that one of the main sources of frustration for physical therapists and one of the main reasons for their burnout and leaving the field after a period of just a few years was that you could work with a patient for a period of time, several hours, and you can get a real improvement in foot drop. That is, the person couldn't raise the foot during the step cycle. It's called dorsiflexion. The patient couldn't dorsiflex, so the limb was just dragged along. They could overcome that. But then Jean told me that if you looked at the parking lot right outside the window, you'd see the patient getting into the car with the same foot drop. Then it occurred to her to start looking sooner, and she would see the patients who had overcome their foot drop, or at least some portion of it. As soon as they crossed the threshold from the treatment area into the corridor outside, would revert right back to foot drop. And this was enormously frustrating. She said it was the main reason why physical therapists stopped being physical therapists, because it wasn't doing any good. It didn't transfer out of the treatment setting. That, by the way, is the reason for our developing the transfer package, not the only reason. The other reason is that in behavioral psychology, it's routine to use these transfer package techniques, monitoring the patient, problem solving with them.
We're running a little bit short of time, and I'm going to refer listeners back to your original interview because you did a good job of explaining that then. I apologize for interrupting, but I do have one thing I want to be sure I ask you before we run out of time. Would you talk a little bit about the patient that you're working with that has a spinal cord injury? Because that's a really fascinating case that shows that maybe plasticity is even a bigger... There's some surprising things there. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. This was an equestrian accident. Patient, trained horses for dressage, for Olympic competition. Once they've been trained, they're immensely valuable. They can be worth more than $1 million. So that an expert horse person is taught, well, not only expert horsewomen, but beginners are taught that if a horse starts to fall, the first thing that you do is you jump out of the saddle and get out of the way. But this horse, she had spent months training this horse, and it was one of these dancing horses. So it wasn't a monetary thing, but all of the effort that she had put into it. She stayed with the horse as it went down in an effort to prevent it from breaking its leg. That didn't happen. It did break its leg, but at the same time she was thrown over the horse's head and fractured vertebrae in the middle of the neck, but the contusion was up at the upper cervical area at C3. So she was on a ventilator, and she was completely paralyzed from the neck down. There was no movement. But it wasn't a transection. The spinal cord wasn't severed. And it's been known for a long time that axons, nerves, pass through the area of injury and connect the brain to the extremities. Only a small percentage of them, perhaps, but the cord is not severed. There is frequently a complete absence of movement. A friend of mine asked me whether I could try to do something for her. Now, traditionally, nothing had ever been done for this kind of patient. This, by the way, is a Christopher Reeve type of injury and cause. And actually, with Christopher Reeve, there was some recovery function, strangely enough, in one arm, and it was due to a passive exercise of the legs on a exercise bicycle. So the legs will move passively, and counterintuitively, the function of the legs never returned, any function, any movement. But one of the arms did improve. And what had clearly happened was that there was an increase in the excitability of the remaining axons, nerve fibers, crossing over the injury. But this was not achieved with direct training of the arm. So there was no overt movement to work with. But I had been involved in biofeedback research. My research actually was in developing a technique for enabling humans to self-control their own tissue temperature, for example, the hand, recording skin temperature, transforming it into electronic signals, and then amplifying those signals and presenting them back to the individual by means of an information display, either a set of lights or sounds, a click rate. People, we found, could learn to increase or decrease the temperature of their hand. This became the second most commonly used modality. At the same time, there was EMG biofeedback carried out by John Bass-Magin and Stephen Wolf and Alex Brudney and others. They recorded from muscles with skin surface electrodes. They transformed those signals and amplified them and posed them on an information display. The initial results were that they were able to get improved movement in arms affected by a stroke and in paraplegic individuals. Then other people got into the field, and at that point, everybody in rehabilitation got their own biofeedback, EMG biofeedback equipment, and started using it. Then a number of investigators who characterized themselves as more rigorous started doing randomized controlled trials, and they were administering the therapy in the wrong way. But the early investigators in the field who got positive results had never said exactly what they were doing. So in the interests of rigor, later investigators were not doing it in the same enthusiastic and patient-supportive way as the first investigators, and they got negative results. So then everybody in rehabilitation gave up what had been a fad. I thought they gave it up too early, and that later investigators weren't really replicating because they weren't doing the same thing. They were straightening out the technique and making it more rigorous. And in the course of making it more rigorous, they were eliminating elements that enabled people to do this very difficult task. Well, that had been in my mind for 30 years, but I never acted on it because I was doing other things. My friend asked me whether there was something that I could do for his partner. He was a very distinguished scientist and an old friend. As a favor, I said, well, I'll try, because I'd also been a friend of his partner for many years as well as he. So I put into effect my ideas about why the later investigators had failed to replicate the early positive results. And we did a shaping procedure. It was CI therapy applied to EMG biofeedback. There was no overt movement, but she had very weak contractions of the shoulder muscles and the biceps. So we gave biofeedback from these muscle contractions that did not result in movement, but we displayed them on a TV monitor, and we had a horizontal line as a threshold where we tried to get her to increase the strength of her contractions. And she did slowly. We gave her one session a week and had her continue practicing with her caregivers when we weren't there. And after 3 months, we got overt movement. We weren't expecting it. She told us that she had been doing those overt minimal movements for 2 weeks and we just hadn't noticed it. We were just focusing on the biofeedback and didn't have any idea that this would succeed. But once we got overt movement, then she had difficulty moving her neck, swiveling her head down so she could see the movement. So we put in a rear view mirror from a motorcycle, clipped it onto the edge of her bedside table. And we did that for 2 weeks, and the movements rapidly became of greater and greater excursion. After 2 weeks, practice at moving the head down enabled her to move the head more. She didn't need mirror feedback. She was able to get direct visual feedback from the movement. And we kept increasing by the shaping technique the amount of movement that was required. And we did this on a trial-by-trial basis. And we timed the trials, and we also measured the excursion. And finally, with gravity eliminated, that is, moving along a flat surface. First, we used the hand skate with a frictionless wheels, and then we just used the flat surface with talcum powder to reduce surface friction. But this was gravity-eliminated movement. She was moving sideways, back and forth, in and out, internal rotation and external rotation, retraction and protraction. The excursion became progressively, week by week, larger and larger. She was practicing during the day. After all, what does a quadriplegic patient do other than watch TV or read on a Kindle apparatus? And she had been an athlete all her life, so this gave her life meaning. And she practiced assiduously. Before we stopped that phase of the training, after 1 year, we were getting internal rotation, which was her best movement, of 20 inches into her body wall, external rotation of about 11 inches, and protraction, moving the arm forward over the surface, of about 12 inches, and retraction about 7 inches. At that point, we tried to get her to use the arm for functional purposes. One purpose was to operate her wheelchair with a toggle switch arrangement. She had been using what is called a sip and puff device, using her breath to propel the wheelchair forward, backwards, and to the side. And we got her to operate her own wheelchair. Unfortunately, our research is unfunded. She already had a sip and puff device there, and the second control system on the toggle switch on the arm of a wheelchair was rudimentary and very unresponsive. And we don't have the $30,000 that we would need to get her a new wheelchair with a responsive mechanism. She's still on a sip and puff device, but she can control the wheelchair really well. Not as well as with the sip and puff device, because the toggle switch arrangement simply is unresponsive. Sometimes you have to get the excursion of the toggle switch almost over to its extreme before the mechanism will engage. Sometimes it will engage much earlier. It's highly variable and unreliable. The next thing we started to do was to see whether we could get gravity only partially eliminated to get her to raise her arm to her mouth so that she could feed herself. And I think we're more than halfway there, but we're using a Swedish sling, which eliminates part of the force of gravity with counterweight system. And we've got her down to eliminating only 1/4 of the force of gravity, and she's able to bring the hand up to the mouth. And we're hoping over the next few months that we'll be able to get her to feed herself or to do various self-care processes using the right arm. The interesting part about this is that we have done structural MRI, voxel-based morphometry, on the spinal cord. This is very hard because the spinal cord compared to the brain, it's such a very small structure that when you're recording from the surface of the body, you just simply can't get very good discrimination of the different parts of the spinal cord. But our preliminary results are that we have increased the size of the gray matter on the trained side of the cord, or the trained side of the cord operating the trained arm, by 50% compared to the untrained left arm, which still is incapable of movement.
Do you know if anyone is trying to replicate this?
No, we haven't published it yet.
Well, her story certainly emphasizes the importance of motivation and the fact that this CI therapy and anything of this sort really requires intense involvement of the patient. The Brain Science Podcast is sponsored by Audible.com, the world's leading provider of downloadable audio content. Many of the books featured on the Brain Science Podcast are available from Audible. I've mentioned in the past Norman Doidge's book, The Brain That Changes Itself, but today I'd like to remind you of one that I featured way back in episode 10 in the first episode about brain plasticity. That book is called Train Your Mind, Change Your Brain by Sharon Begley, Begley. Don't let the title turn you off. If you enjoyed the conversation with the Dalai Lama and Dr. Doidge, Merznick, and Dr. Taub, you will enjoy this book because it goes into a lot of the history of the discovery of brain plasticity, including the work of Dr. Taub. If you aren't already an Audible subscriber, you can get this or any other title for free by going to audiblepodcast.com/brain science. This CI therapy and anything of this sort really requires intense involvement of the patient.
That's true, it does, but it turns out that a person with impaired movement, the largest majority of them, the main thing they want in their lives is to improve the function or get a return of at least part of the lost movement. And that becomes the primary objective, their main goal in life. Not all patients, some of them don't care. But we find that even depressed patients, like after stroke, want to get a recovery of movement. And so that almost all of the patients that we work with we get a similar treatment effect. They may have motivation for almost nothing else, but they want to get a return of their motor function. This person that we're working with now is an ideal subject, but I know that other tetraplegic or quadriplegic patients that I've spoken to, and everyone who works with them knows that their main goal in life is to get some return of function.
So it's not really motivation that...
It is motivation.
I mean, what I was going to say is it's not motivation that's an obstacle for making the use of CI therapy more widespread. It's more the expense of therapists and the fact that insurance doesn't want to pay for it.
Right.
Do they use it in other parts of the world?
Yes, it's used all over the world, more than in the United States, in China, in the Orient, Japan, Taiwan, Malaysia. There's also CI therapy in Turkey, some in Egypt, a lot in Sao Paulo, which is a metropolitan area of more than 25 million people in Brazil. There are, at this point, about 700 papers, published papers on CI therapy, representing a fair amount of CI therapy being administered to patients. In the United States, not so much.
Because therapists are so expensive.
And insurance companies won't reimburse for it. Some do, like in the practice guidelines of the VA and the Department of Defense. CI therapy is one of the 2 therapies mentioned by name recommended for rehabilitation of stroke patients. It's not used in the VA or in the military because the therapists aren't trained to use it. We do have a training program here, but there are hundreds of thousands of PTs and OTs in this country, and we're not able to train that many, but we can scale up if we had the money. So the Department of Defense has given us a substantial grant at this point to treat veterans, especially veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, who have experienced a traumatic brain injury, a TBI, and have motor deficit. We are working on that project now, and we're recruiting patients, and it's without cost.
If you're a veteran.
That's if you're a veteran. Actually, we've had paperwork trouble getting recruitment started and through the 3 VA medical centers that we're collaborating with. And so now we are recruiting civilian TBI patients. TBI, is the signature wound of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. And this is a blinded, randomized controlled trial of CI therapy with a comparison therapy given the same amount of time. And if successful, we're hoping that this becomes the standard of care in the military and in the VA. If that happens, then we're hoping that Medicare and Medicaid will follow suit. We do have also reimbursement from the Federal Employees Medical Program for the civil service. CI therapy is an allowed expense. The problem is that people start doing CI therapy, and we've published our techniques in great detail in at least 4 papers. And the therapists and the physiatrists basically can't make heads or tails of it. Our transfer package techniques are just alien to the rehabilitation field.
So do you keep a list of the people who you have trained? Do you know where they went?
We don't do follow-up past a year with them. It's expensive. You've got a 3 or 4 year grant period. You can't get funding for follow-up past a year. And we don't have the money to pursue that. I would dearly love to, especially with our transfer package, and see what happens. But if you don't follow up the whole sample, investigators in the field won't believe your results. They'll believe that you've selected the patients to follow up on. You've got to follow up on the whole sample.
I meant, I know you have a training program. Do you keep a list of the people you've trained? I mean, the therapists that you've trained.
Oh, yes. Yeah, sure, we do.
Because, I get emails all the time, and I'm sure that I will get more emails after this interview for people who want to get this therapy but don't live near UAB.
Right. Then it becomes a little more expensive because then they would have to pay for their travel and their food and lodging while they were here.
But you've trained therapists that are working around the country.
Yeah, but I don't know which of them are actually doing the technique and whether they're doing it correctly.
Right. I guess that's a tricky thing.
I couldn't vouch for them. But in our TBI project funded by DOD, we pay for the treatment. We also pay for their travel and their living expenses when they're here. So all they have to do is give us 3 weeks, and everything is paid for.
So that's good to know. I'm sure that some of the people listening to this will know people that fall into the category of TBI, because unfortunately that is not only common among the veterans, but in the civilian population too.
And we welcome them to contact us. I could give you a phone number.
Do you want to go ahead and say that?
Sure. Area code 205-934-9768.
Fantastic.
That's 205-934-9768, and that will get them to Stacy McKay, who is the coordinator of the project.
Okay, and I'll put that in the show notes too so that people will be able to find it. I know you're probably really excited about that project, but it always takes a long time to get these things off the ground, doesn't it?
It's taken us a year. We're through with one of the VA medical centers, and the 2 others are trembling on the lip. We've got all the permissions, and now we've got to duplicate the recruitment materials, and each one of their institutional review boards is requiring changes in our basic recruitment material, and it all takes time, but we're anticipating that we'll be into full swing recruitment in about 2 weeks.
Is there anything else you'd like to share before we close?
Yeah, a couple of things. The first thing is that we've developed a form of CI therapy for language that we call CI aphasia therapy. We introduced that in 2001, and we've greatly modified it. And we now get just as good results with language, speech, expressive language, as we do with movement. This is after stroke. And the second thing is that the transfer package, several of our patients did this informally. After they left, they followed our instructions for continuing to use the more affected arm. One of our patients was an ophthalmologist. He took up the piano, and after 5 years, he invited us to his 60th birthday party.
Was that Dr. Bernstein?
That was. My wife is a musician. She is a singer, but she started out as a pianist. And I asked her whether she could tell which was the arm affected by the stroke, and she couldn't. It was the left arm, and the left hand was just as strong as the right hand. She's a professional musician who started out as a pianist, so that my wife then went to his piano teacher and asked her whether she could tell the difference between the left and the right hand, and she said no, she couldn't.
That's because he kept on working and working and working.
For 5 years, he would play the piano every day. He left the treatment setting here with a substantial deficit, a great improvement, but still a substantial deficit. And by continuing to work for 5 years, there is, for casual observation, no apparent difference between the left and the right hand. Then there was a Iraq War veteran who we treated 5 years ago. He brought a friend of his up to be treated in our clinic, and when he came in, we shook hands. And I said, well, very funny. Now let's shake with your more affected arm. And he said, that was my more affected arm. And he had virtually brought me to my knees. He was a Marine, and he was really fit, and he maintained that fitness. The point is that that military discipline was enormously effective in keeping him at it as a physical discipline. I'm sure that experimentally I could have elicited a deficit, But to casual observation in the normal course of moving, you couldn't tell the difference. That brings me back to the thing that I said very early in our talk, and that is that we do not really know what the limits of rehabilitation are. That needs to be reevaluated. An impediment is the insurance reimbursement policies of many companies, so that in order to tell you need to have funding to carry out the research. But the point is that we really do not know what the limits of rehabilitation are.
That's a very good place for us to close.
Yes. Hope for the future.
Absolutely. Well, Ed, I've really enjoyed getting to talk with you again. We'll just have to do a better job of keeping in touch over the next several years than we did before this.
Well, in a couple of years, we ought to have some more results. But thank you very much. And I've enjoyed our conversation very much also.
First of all, I want to apologize for splitting Dr. Taub's interview into two parts. This is not something I intend to do on a regular basis. I think that the last half of his interview contains three key ideas. First, overcoming learned non-use is a critical component in the success of CI therapy. Norman Doidge would probably call learned non-use the dark side of plasticity, since the nervous system seems to follow the rule, use it or lose it, just like it can be demonstrated that both gray and white matter increase with use. Not using an affected body part rapidly leads to loss of mass, both in the muscles and in the brain area that controls that limb. This loss must then be overcome for successful rehabilitation. I can't help but thinking that traditional methods that focus on learning to use the good limb actually exacerbate this process. But it also emphasizes why it is so important that patients continue to work outside the rehab setting. The transfer package that Dr. Taub kept referring to is the method they use to encourage this. Basically, the patient has to agree that they're going to use the affected limb outside rehab instead of doing things in ways that might be easier, like using their strong side. The spinal cord patient that we talked about was really fascinating because in working with her, Dr. Taub is showing that the principles of neuroplasticity also apply to the spinal cord if it's not totally severed. The way he used EMG biofeedback in the beginning also demonstrates the importance of being willing and able to combine techniques to fit the needs of individual patients. Third, Dr. Taub emphasized we do not currently know the limits of rehab. My friend Dr. Michael Bernstein is an example of someone who continued to improve because he was willing to keep working after he left formal rehab. But clearly, we need ways for these techniques to reach more patients. Even at UAB, where Dr. Taub works, most patients never receive CI therapy, partly because a lot of doctors don't know about it and often because it's not covered by their insurance. Hopefully, this is less of a problem outside the United States, but clearly there also needs to be a better way to get more therapists properly trained. It is unfortunate that Dr. Taub doesn't feel comfortable referring people to the therapists that he has trained, because one reason I did this interview was because I want more people to know about these approaches. I'm not trying to get anyone to travel to Birmingham, Alabama. But for those of you who might want to learn more about the trial that is currently open to TBI or traumatic brain injury patients, the number Taub gave was 205-934-9768. You can also visit the website taubtherapy.com, T-A-U-B as in boy, therapy.com. That page has a toll-free number and a link that you can use to request more information. I will put this link in the show notes at brainsciencepodcast.com. That's where you can find detailed show notes for every episode and transcripts. You can also send me feedback at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. Before I talk a bit about upcoming episodes, I do want to make a few announcements. First, I was recently interviewed for the Humanist Hour, and that should be going online on July 8th, 2015. I will be presenting a short talk at the upcoming podcast movement during the PMX pre-session. The podcast movement is being held in Fort Worth, Texas, July 31st through August 2nd, 2015. My talk's on July 31st, and it is entitled To Edit or Not to Edit. Another thing that's happening at the podcast movement is the announcement of some podcasting awards, and the Brain Science Podcast is a finalist for Best Science and Medicine Podcast. The winners will be announced in the ceremony on the evening of July 31st, and this is open to the public. So you can come to this. It's whoever gets there if you're going to be in the area. Also, if you are going to be at Podcast Movement or live in the Fort Worth area, please do drop me an email so we can get together. I also want to mention that there is a new episode of Books and Ideas that I put out a few weeks ago. It's with Elsie Escobar, and we talk about why we podcast. And I want to mention that Books and Ideas is now available on Stitcher. As far as upcoming episodes of the Brain Science Podcast go, now that I've finished my palliative medicine fellowship, I hope to be able to get more caught up on reading and creating more new content. I am working on an episode with Dr. Bud Craig to talk about the insula and interoception, and I'm also planning an episode about placebos with Dr. Fabrizio Benedetti. Meanwhile, I hope that you will visit the website brainsciencepodcast.com. And while you're there, I hope you will sign up for the free Brain Science Podcast newsletter. I try to put the Brain Science Podcast out every month, and with the newsletter, you will be notified as soon as new content is available. The most recent 25 episodes are always free, while older episodes of the Brain Science Podcast and transcripts are available to premium subscribers for only $5 a month. Since I started the premium subscription in January 2014, many listeners have told me that they appreciate having such an easy way to support my work. But some people do prefer to purchase individual episodes or transcripts, and you can do that at brainsciencepodcast.com. Some listeners also make direct donations. But even if you can't afford to support the show financially, you can help by sharing the Brain Science Podcast with others. I could really use some new reviews in iTunes and Stitcher. And if you're trying to share the Brain Science Podcast with a friend and they aren't someone who already listens to podcasts, the easiest way is to send them, assuming that they have a smartphone, send them to the free Brain Science mobile app. The easiest way for them to find it is for you to tell them to go into the App Store, whether it be Apple, Android, or even Windows Phone, go into the App Store and search under Ginger Campbell. That way they'll see both the Brain Science app and Books and Ideas. Both of these apps are free. So finally, I just want to remind you that I would love to hear your feedback. You can send me email at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. You can also send feedback directly through the Brain Science mobile app, or you can post to our Facebook fan page, our Google Plus page, or our Goodreads discussion page. There's links to all these on the website. And you can follow me at Twitter, where I am Doc Artemis, DocArtemis. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again soon. The Brain Science Podcast is copyright 2015 Virginia Campbell, MD. You can copy this podcast to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. The new theme music for the Brain Science Podcast is Mindfire by Tony Catraccia. You can find his work at syncopationnow.com.